The rain hammered against the windows of the Admiralty Building in London like Morse code warnings no one wanted to read. October 1939. Britain had been at war with Germany for barely a month, and already the North Sea was turning into a graveyard. Commander Charles Gedive stood in the hallway outside the Naval Intelligence Office, water dripping from his soaked overcoat onto the polished floor, clutching a leather briefcase that contained diagrams most senior officers had already dismissed as theoretical nonsense. Inside that briefcase was a solution to a problem the Royal Navy didn't yet fully understand it had. Gedive wasn't a military man by training. He was a physicist, a professor from University College London who'd spent years studying magnetism and electrical fields in laboratory conditions far removed from the chaos of naval warfare. His hands were soft, unmarked by rope burns or gunpowder. His eyes carried the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many hours reading by lamplight. At 42, he looked more like a schoolteacher than someone who would revolutionize submarine warfare. But he'd seen the reports. Merchant ships disappearing in shallow waters where no torpedoes had been fired. Destroyers going down in channels that had been swept for conventional mines just hours before. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who understood magnetic physics. Germany had developed magnetic mines, weapons that detonated not from physical contact but from sensing the metal hull of a passing ship. The door opened. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser emerged, his face carved from granite and decades of command. "Gedive," he said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of a man who'd heard 100 desperate ideas in the past week alone. "You have 5 minutes." Inside the room, 3 other senior officers sat around a table covered in maps of the North Sea and Channel approaches. They looked at Gedive the way cats look at rain, with instinctive distrust. One of them, a captain whose name Gedive didn't catch, was already checking his watch. "Gentlemen," Gedive began, opening his briefcase with hands that trembled slightly, "the German magnetic mines are sinking our ships because our steel hulls create measurable magnetic fields. The mines detect these fields from below and detonate when the field reaches sufficient strength." "We know this already," the captain interrupted. "We've recovered one of their mines. We're working on countermeasures." "Traditional minesweeping won't work," Gedive pressed on, pulling out his first diagram. "These weapons don't need to be touched. They're triggered by invisible signatures our ships can't help but produce. Every steel vessel is essentially a floating magnet." Admiral Fraser leaned forward slightly. "What are you proposing?" "Degaussing," Gedive said, laying out a technical drawing of a ship wrapped in electrical cable. "We run electrical current through cables wound around the ship's hull. This creates an opposing magnetic field that neutralizes the ship's natural magnetism. To a magnetic mine, a degaussed ship becomes invisible." The silence that followed felt like pressure before a storm. "You want to turn our entire fleet into electrical experiments?" The captain's voice dripped with skepticism. "While they're at sea, with crews aboard." "It's the only way," Gedive insisted. "I've done the calculations. The current required is manageable, the installation is feasible, and the results—" "The results are theoretical," another officer cut in. "You're a university man, Dr. Gedive. You deal in theories. We deal in steel, fuel, and men's lives. What you're suggesting could electrocute entire crews, interfere with navigation equipment, or simply not work at all." Fraser held up a hand, silencing the room. He studied Gedive's face for a long moment, looking for something, conviction, perhaps, or madness. "How confident are you?" Gedive met his gaze without blinking. "If we don't do this, sir, we'll lose 100 ships before Christmas. If we do it and I'm wrong, you can court-martial me personally." "But I'm not wrong." The admiral glanced at the other officers, then back at Gedive. "You'll get 1 ship, 1 trial. If it works, we'll talk about implementation. If it fails—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Gedive gathered his papers, his heart hammering. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret." "I already regret it," Fraser said quietly. "Every decision in wartime is regret waiting to happen." Dismissed. Outside in the rain-slicked street, Gedive allowed himself one moment of relief before the terror set in. He had his chance. Now he had to make it work. The problem was that making it work meant convincing shipyard workers to install experimental equipment, naval engineers to trust calculations they couldn't verify, and sailors to board a vessel wrapped in live electrical cables that might kill them before any mine did. The Admiralty had given him HMS Board, a minesweeper scheduled for refit. She was old, tired, and according to the quartermaster's report, already overdue for scrapping. Perfect for an experiment that might end in catastrophic failure. Gedive walked through the darkened London streets toward his temporary office, passing air raid wardens and sandbagged buildings. Somewhere out in the darkness of the North Sea, another ship was probably hitting a magnetic mine, breaking apart in seconds, sending men into water so cold it killed in minutes. He had 3 weeks to turn theory into salvation. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance, air raid sirens began their mournful wail. The Portsmouth Naval Dockyard smelled of paint, oil, rust, and the perpetual salt rot that ate at everything the sea could touch. HMS Board sat in dry dock like a beached whale, her hull exposed and scarred from years of service. She was 245 feet of aging steel that had swept mines in the last war and was expected to do it again in this one, if she survived what Charles Gedive was about to do to her. Chief Engineer Robert McKinnon stood on the dock with his arms crossed, watching a team of civilian electricians unload massive spools of heavy-gauge copper cable. He was a Scotsman built like a boiler, with hands that could rebuild a destroyer's engine blindfolded, but looked profoundly skeptical about wrapping his ship in what he called a bloody electric blanket. "Dr. Gedive," McKinnon said as the physicist approached, carrying yet another sheaf of diagrams, "with all due respect, sir, this is madness. You want to run 200 amps through cables wrapped around my hull, while my men are aboard, while we're floating on salt water, which, if you recall your basic science, conducts electricity rather well." Gedive had heard variations of this argument for 2 weeks straight. "The cables will be insulated, Chief. Triple-wrapped rubber coating. The current will flow through the wire, not into the water or the hull." "And if the insulation fails? If a cable chafes through? If we take damage from a mine or a bomb?" "Then we'll have bigger problems than electrical shock," Gedive said quietly. "Chief, I know this sounds insane, but the magnetic mines are sinking ships daily. Yesterday it was the Blair Spey off the Thames estuary. Last week it was—" "I know the list," McKinnon interrupted, his voice softer now. "I knew men on the Gypsy. Good men. Gone in seconds." He looked up at his ship, at the scaffolding already being erected along her hull. "How long will the installation take?" 72 hours if we work around the clock. We'll wind the cable in a continuous loop from bow to stern, port to starboard, creating a uniform field that exactly opposes the ship's natural magnetism." "And you've tested this?" "On a scale model. The mathematics are sound." McKinnon let out a long breath. "Mathematics don't keep sailors alive, Doctor. Engineering does. But I'll give you your 3 days. After that, we run live tests, and if anything feels wrong, I'm pulling the plug myself." The work began that afternoon. Teams of electricians, naval engineers, and dockyard workers swarmed over HMS Board like ants on a carcass. The process was brutally physical. Massive cable drums had to be positioned, heavy copper wire had to be manhandled into place, and every inch of the hull had to be measured and marked to ensure the magnetic field would be uniform. Gedive worked alongside them, his university suits replaced by coveralls, his soft hands developing blisters within hours. He measured magnetic field strengths with sensitive instruments, adjusted cable positions by fractions of inches, and recalculated his equations a dozen times each night in a dockyard office that smelled of diesel and desperation. On the second day, they hit their first real problem. One of the electricians, a young man named Davies who couldn't have been more than 20, was working near the stern when his wrench slipped and struck the bare copper where two cable sections were being joined. The resulting arc flash was brilliant blue-white, loud as a gunshot, and left Davies on his back with his eyebrows singed off and his hands shaking. Work stopped immediately. Men gathered around, muttering. McKinnon pulled Gedive aside. "That cable wasn't even live yet," the engineer said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That was residual charge from testing. When you run full current through this system, one mistake like that will kill a man instantly." "I know," Gedive said, feeling the weight of it. "I know. We'll implement additional safety protocols. Double insulated gloves for anyone working near the cables. Kill switches at every junction point. Training for the entire crew. Training." McKinnon's laugh was bitter. "Doctor, most of my crew can't even spell electromagnetic. You're asking them to live inside a science experiment." "I'm asking them to live, period," Gedive shot back. "Because without this, the board has a life expectancy of maybe 6 weeks once she puts to sea. With it—" He trailed off, looking at the half-wrapped hull. "With it, she might come home." That night, while the crew slept, Gedive sat alone in the dockyard with his calculations spread before him. The mathematics were beautiful, elegant, perfect. But mathematics didn't bleed. Mathematics didn't drown in the North Sea while screaming for help that would never come. By the morning of the third day, the installation was complete. HMS board looked bizarre, wrapped in thick cables that ran in geometric patterns around her hull, junction boxes bolted to her deck, massive generators humming below. She looked like a ship that had been captured by some mechanical spider. The moment of truth came at dawn on the fourth day. The board was refloated, her crew aboard, her generators warming up. Gedive stood on the bridge with McKinnon and the ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander James Weatherby, a young officer who'd volunteered for this madness with the calm acceptance of a man who'd already seen too many friends die. "Ready when you are, Doctor," Weatherby said. Gedive picked up the telephone connected to the engineering spaces. "Begin power-up sequence. Start at 20% and increase gradually." Below decks, the generators spun faster. The hum became audible throughout the ship, a low, thrumming vibration that you could feel in your bones. The ammeter on the bridge began to climb. 50 amps, 75, 100. Hull temperature readings normal, an engineer reported over the intercom. No hot spots, no arcing. 150 amps. The lights on the bridge flickered slightly but held steady. "Magnetic field readings," Gedive called out, watching his instruments. A sailor with a magnetometer moved around the deck, calling out numbers. They were perfect. The ship's magnetic signature was dropping, being cancelled out by the induced field from the cables. 200 amps. Full power. The board hummed like a living thing. Gedive held his breath, waiting for the catastrophic failure, the scream of electrocuted men, the flash of fire. Nothing happened. McKinnon checked his gauges, then checked them again. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "It's working. The magnetic signature is down to nearly 0. Weatherby looked at Gedive with something approaching respect. "Now we just have to see if it actually stops a mine." "For that," Gedive said quietly, "we'll need to sail into a minefield." The silence that followed was broken only by the generator's steady hum and the lap of water against the hull. The North Sea in November 1939 was a gray hell that stretched to every horizon. HMS board cut through 6-foot swells, her degaussing cables humming with 200 amps of current, her crew manning their stations with the quiet tension of men sailing into their own potential graves. Lieutenant Commander Weatherby stood on the bridge, binoculars raised, scanning the water ahead for the telltale markers that indicated a suspected minefield. Charles Gedive stood beside him, pale and silent. He'd wanted to prove his theory. Now he was about to do exactly that, and if he was wrong, 63 men would die in the next hour. The Admiralty had chosen the testing ground carefully, a stretch of water off the Thames estuary where 3 merchant ships had been sunk in the past 2 weeks, all with the characteristic suddenness of magnetic mine detonations. German aircraft had been spotted over this area repeatedly. Intelligence suggested the Luftwaffe had seeded the approaches with dozens of the new weapons. The board was sailing directly into that killing zone. "Approaching the first marker," called out the navigator, a lieutenant named Harris, whose voice remained steady despite the beads of sweat on his forehead. "Estimated minefield boundary in 400 yards. McKinnon emerged from below decks, his face grim. "Degaussing system is at full power. All readings nominal. For whatever that's worth." Weatherby lowered his binoculars. "Dr. Gedive, this is your last chance to reconsider. We can turn back, run the tests another way." "There is no other way," Gedive said quietly. "Either the system works, or it doesn't. We need to know." 300 yards, Harris reported. The bridge fell silent except for the wind and the generator's thrum. Every man knew the mathematics of a magnetic mine detonation. The weapon sat on the seafloor, its sensors constantly measuring magnetic field strength in the water above. When a steel ship passed overhead, the magnetic field spiked. When that spike reached the mine's threshold, roughly the signature of a 3,000-ton vessel, the detonator fired. 300 pounds of high explosive would create a bubble of gas that would break a ship's keel like a dry twig. If Gedive's system worked, the board would pass over the mines without triggering them, her magnetic signature reduced to nearly nothing. If it didn't work, they would know for approximately 2 seconds before the sea tore them apart. 200 yards. A sailor on the foredeck crossed himself. Another checked his life vest for the 3rd time in as many minutes, even though they all knew life vests were useless in these waters. The cold would kill you before you could drown. 100 yards. Entering suspected minefield boundary. Weatherby gripped the rail. McKinnon closed his eyes briefly, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or profanity. Gedive stared at the magnetometer mounted on the bridge console, watching the needle hold steady at nearly 0 signature. 50 yards. The board plowed forward, her bow cutting through the gray water, her wake spreading behind her in a white V. Somewhere below, in the darkness of the seafloor, magnetic mines sat waiting, their circuits calibrating, their sensors reading. Nothing. "Mark!" Harris called out. "We're in the center of the projected minefield." Seconds passed. 5, 10, 15. No explosion. No geyser of water. No death. The bridge remained silent, every man afraid to breathe, waiting for the delayed detonation, the mine they'd missed, the catastrophic error in Gedive's calculations. 50 yards past center point, Harris reported, his voice climbing with something that might have been hope. 100 yards. We're through the densest sector. McKinnon opened his eyes. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he whispered. "It's actually working." But Weatherby wasn't celebrating. "Navigator, plot a course back through the field. East-west crossing this time. If we're going to test this properly, we test it thoroughly." "Sir." Harris looked at him with poorly concealed horror. "You heard me, Lieutenant. Turn us around. And reduce speed to 8 knots. I want to give any mines down there plenty of time to sense us if they're going to." The second pass was worse than the first. Knowing the mines were there, knowing they were sailing slowly over invisible death, turned every wave slap against the hull into a potential detonation. Gedive found himself counting seconds, mentally calculating the distance between the ship's keel and the seafloor, imagining the mines below with their primitive but deadly circuits trying and failing to detect the steel ghost passing overhead. They made it through. And then Weatherby ordered a 3rd pass. This time they stopped engines entirely in the middle of the field, letting the board drift with the current for a full minute, an eternity of vulnerability. If the degaussing system had any weak points, any gaps in coverage, a drifting ship would give the mines time to find them. The generators hummed. The cables thrummed. The men waited. 1 minute became 2. McKinnon monitored his instruments obsessively, looking for any sign of magnetic field fluctuation, any indication that the ship's signature was bleeding through the protective envelope. "All readings stable," he reported. "Signature remains near 0. On the bridge wing, a young sailor named Peterson suddenly shouted, pointing at the water. "Sir, something in the water. Starboard bow." Every head turned. There, about 30 yards off the starboard bow, a dark shape broke the surface, a moored mine, visible for just a moment before sinking back below. But that glimpse was enough to see its spherical shape, its protruding horns, its cable anchor disappearing into the depths. They were drifting directly toward it. "Hard to port," Weatherby barked. "Full reverse." The board's engines roared to life. The ship shuddered, her propellers biting into the water, dragging her sideways and backward. The mine's cable scraped along the hull with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid, metal on metal, close enough to touch. But it didn't detonate. The contact mine's horns never crushed. The magnetic mine below the surface never sensed its target. The board slid past and away, engines churning, every man on deck staring at the water where death had brushed against them and moved on. When they finally cleared the minefield and turned for Portsmouth, the silence on the bridge broke with a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob from Lieutenant Harris. McKinnon sagged against a bulkhead. Weatherby lit a cigarette with hands that shook only slightly. Charles Gedive stood alone at the starboard rail, watching the gray sea slide past. He'd been right. The mathematics had worked. The theory had become reality. But he felt no triumph, only a crushing awareness of how close they'd come, how many ways it could have failed, how many men's lives had depended on his calculations being perfect. "Dr. Gedive," Weatherby said from behind him, "I need to radio the Admiralty. What should I tell them?" Gedive turned, his face drawn but his voice steady. "Tell them it works. Tell them we sailed through a known minefield 3 times without incident. Tell them every ship in the fleet needs degaussing equipment installed immediately. And tell them," he added quietly, "that we're going to need a lot more copper cable." The board steamed toward port, her degaussing cables humming with life-saving current, carrying proof that an academic's disavowed invention had just become the Royal Navy's newest salvation. The Portsmouth dockyard was transformed within weeks. What had been Charles Gedive's desperate experiment on a single aging minesweeper became a massive industrial operation that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By December 1939, teams of electricians worked on a dozen ships simultaneously, wrapping hulls in copper cable, installing generators, training crews. The sound of arc welders and the smell of rubber insulation became the new normal in every British naval yard. But success brought its own complications. Gedive sat in Admiral Fraser's office in London, exhausted from traveling between shipyards, overseeing installations, training crews. He'd lost 15 pounds and gained shadows under his eyes that looked permanent. Across the desk, Fraser studied a report with the expression of a man reading his own problematic salvation. "The Germans know," the Admiral said bluntly. "They've noticed that ships are suddenly surviving passages through areas that should be deadly. They're already modifying their mines, adjusting the sensitivity, trying to compensate." "It was inevitable," Gedive replied. "But even if they make the mines more sensitive, degaussing still works. They'd have to completely redesign their triggering mechanisms, and that takes time. Time we're using to install your system on every vessel that can carry it." Fraser tapped the report. "As of this morning, 87 ships have been fitted. The loss rate in magnetic minefields has dropped by 73%. 73%. Gedive. Do you understand what that means?" Gedive did. It meant hundreds of sailors who would wake up tomorrow instead of drowning in the North Sea. It meant cargo vessels delivering food and fuel instead of settling to the bottom. It meant the Atlantic lifeline that Britain desperately needed would stay open. But Fraser wasn't finished. The problem is submarine warfare. Our submariners need this technology more than anyone, but installing degaussing equipment on a submarine is. He trailed off, shaking his head. Nearly impossible, Gedive finished. I know. Submarines operate on battery power when submerged. Running a degaussing system would drain their batteries too quickly, and they don't have the space for the heavy generators needed for surface operations. So our submarine fleet remains vulnerable. Not necessarily. Gedive pulled out a new set of diagrams, these ones covered in smaller calculations, different configurations. I've been working on a modified system. Lighter cables, lower power requirements, designed to run only during critical moments, entering and leaving port, transiting known mined waters. It won't provide continuous protection, but it doesn't need to. Submarines spend most of their time either deep underwater or in open ocean. Fraser leaned forward, studying the designs. Can you make it work? With the right engineering team, yes. It'll require completely different implementation, permanent installation in the pressure hull, automatic activation systems, integration with the submarine's existing electrical systems. But yes, sir. I believe it can work. Then do it. Pick your team. You'll have whatever resources you need. Over the next 6 months, Gedive and a hand-picked team of engineers virtually lived aboard HMS Seraph, a submarine volunteered for the retrofit. The work was claustrophobic, frustrating, and occasionally dangerous. Working inside a submarine's pressure hull with high-voltage cables and limited space meant constant risk. But by March 1940, the installation was complete. The test came during Seraph's deployment to the Mediterranean, where German and Italian mines made the approaches to Malta a death trap. Lieutenant Commander Norman "Bill" Jewell, the submarine's captain, took her through the Sicilian Channel, a passage where 2 British submarines had been lost in the previous month. The degaussing system activated automatically as they entered the danger zone. Inside the cramped control room, Jewell monitored depth, speed, and the steady hum of the degaussing cables. Unlike surface ships, submarines couldn't see the mines they were avoiding. They could only trust the invisible shield and hope. Seraph made it through, and then through again, and again. By the end of 1940, the degaussing system, both the surface version and Gedive's submarine adaptation, had been installed on virtually every British naval vessel and most critical merchant ships. The technology spread to Allied navies. Canadian, Norwegian, Polish vessels all received the equipment. American naval engineers studied the design and began implementing their own versions. The German magnetic mine threat, which had seemed unstoppable in the war's first months, was largely neutralized. Charles Gedive never sought recognition for his work. The degaussing program remained classified throughout the war, and even afterward, most people didn't know about the physicist who turned electromagnetic theory into a life-saving shield. He went back to his university position after the war, taught students, published papers on magnetic field theory. But in 1955, 16 years after HMS Board's first trial, Gedive received a letter from Robert McKinnon, the skeptical engineer who'd overseen that first installation. The letter was brief. Dr. Gedive, thought you'd want to know. Board was finally scrapped last month, after 37 years of service. Those cables you wrapped around her saved her from mines at least a dozen times during the war. The crew called her the lucky ship. But we both know it wasn't luck. It was mathematics. And courage. Thank you for both. McKinnon. Attached to the letter was a photograph. HMS Board in her final days, rusty and tired, her degaussing cables still visible on her hull after years of service. Gedive kept that photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. When colleagues or students asked about it, he would tell them about electromagnetic fields, about the mathematics of magnetic mines, about the importance of translating theory into practice. But what he remembered, always, was standing on the bridge of that old minesweeper as she sailed into a field of invisible death, trusting nothing but calculations and conviction. He remembered the silence before the first pass, the terror of the second, the impossible relief of survival. The degaussing system saved an estimated 1,200 ships during World War II. Ships that carried soldiers to battle, food to starving populations, fuel to keep the war effort alive. How many lives that represented was impossible to calculate precisely. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. All because a university physicist refused to accept that the impossible was impossible, that theory couldn't become reality, that a ship wrapped in copper cable couldn't become invisible to death waiting below. In the decades after the war, degaussing technology continued to evolve. Modern navies still use variations of Gedive's system, though the cables are lighter, the generators more efficient, the mathematics refined by computers that would have seemed like science fiction in 1939. But the principle remains the same. Create an opposing magnetic field, neutralize the signature, become invisible to weapons that hunt by magnetism. Charles Gedive died in 1980, at the age of 83. His obituaries mentioned his academic achievements, his wartime service, his contributions to physics. Few mentioned that he'd saved the Atlantic lifeline with nothing but wire, mathematics, and the courage to test a disavowed theory in a minefield that had already killed dozens of men. But in naval archives and engineering schools, in the technical manuals of submarine warfare and the classified reports of naval defense systems, his work lives on. Every degaussed ship that passes safely over a magnetic mine is a tribute to the scientist who refused to accept that the impossible couldn't be proven possible. The sea remembers. The ships remember. The cables still hum with protective current, invisible shields against invisible death. And somewhere in the gray waters of the North Sea, rusted cable fragments might still lie on the seafloor, pieces of HMS board, pieces of salvation, monuments to the moment when theory became survival.